is think about how you want to feel on your wedding day. You're a VIP too at this wedding. It's not just a bride, you're equally VIPs. I also think finding a planner who is accustomed to working with a budget similar to yours is a good thing to think about.
Welcome to the Hawaii Wedding Podcast by HNL Studios. My name is Keisha, and I'm your host for today. In today's podcast, we invited Louise, a wedding planner and designer from Love Letter Weddings. In today's episode, she shares about the ins and outs of wedding planning and how to make planning a wedding in Hawaii easy and stress-free. Let's see what she has to share with us. Thank you for being with us today, Louise. And I did want to ask if you could share with us just a little bit more of how long you've been in the wedding industry and how you got into it and how you've been able to grow in this industry in the past years.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started my business in 2010. So I've been doing it for a while now. For me, it was very much an epiphany moment. I moved here from Washington State to go to the UH and travel to go to the travel industry management school here at the Tim School. And when I was there, I was trying out different things. I was, thinking about working in hotels, thinking about working in the airlines. And then I saw a class for event management. And right at that moment, I knew I was like, that's what I want to do. Unfortunately for me, that class didn't fit into my schedule that semester, of course. So I ended up pursuing it, event management through a course at KCC, and then I did an internship. And then right after I graduated, when I was 23, I started my business. I think over the years, my business has definitely developed. But from the get-go, I've always specialized in destination weddings. And I've always cared a lot about the relationship with the couple, as well as making the event beautiful. And at Love Letter Weddings, it doesn't necessarily mean being over the top, crazy, fancy, and expensive, although we love, good budgets. But it's really about making events thoughtful and cohesive. And that's primarily what we specialize, whether it's through the communication or the design aspect of wedding planning.
Yeah, that's amazing. And he did mention that you plan, you do a lot of event planning. When you think of weddings in Hawaii, um, what do you think? Well, in general, I guess, weddings in general, what do you think is one important thing that couples should consider before they dive into the whole process of planning the wedding day?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of things to think about. But the thing that I really like to stress with my clients is think about how you want to feel on your wedding day, because that's going to inform so many of your decisions that you make throughout the entire planning process. I feel like there's a lot of pressure to, choose the perfect venue or your wedding colors, and these things are hard to decide on right away. But if you know you want it to be casual or formal or a raging dance party or a low-key dinner party, kind of thinking about how you want the day to feel will really help you make decisions, kind of moving forward, whether it's you're choosing your venue or, the music or the decor. And I always encourage couples to make this decision together, not just one or the other, come up with this plan together as a couple.
Yeah, I guess coming from that, sometimes I feel like it's well, I guess sometimes there's just a sense of one part of the couple is a bit more active, usually the bride, a bit more proactive in the planning, and then sometimes the guy just sits back because sometimes they feel like their fiance knows more about it. Do you have methods to try to draw the groom or the other partner to feel a bit more
Yeah,
engaged?
that's a great question. I mean, I feel like in a way I'm kind of naturally lucky to attract couples that like to plan their wedding together. I would say more than half of my clients will tackle the planning equally. And every once in a while I'll have a groom take the lead, which is really fun. And I find it so sweet because it's either the bride is too busy or the groom just loves to plan. And that becomes fun. But I mean, for me, onboarding, I always encourage them both to be a part of it. And I think um, that really comes into play with like talking about the budget because that really does affect both of them. And so I'll usually have both of them be a part of that meeting. And then we use wedding planning software and I have them both be members of it, not just the bride, you know. And so I really try and get them involved in different ways. But for me, I prefer to just take the lead of my client. I don't ever want to force someone to participate if they don't really want to, but I will find out which things each person cares about more. And that usually comes about in the budget conversation. You know, like maybe I know like the groom like loves food and music. So those are kind of going to be his areas where the bride is like more focused on the decor. And that way, you know, I kind of can tailor how I get each person involved in the planning process.
I think that's great because, sometimes I feel like grooms just don't know that their opinions are welcome. And it's good to like put them into something that they're interested in and something that they a part of the wedding that they like
Yeah.
they're very interested in.
I always tell them,
And
I'm like, you're a VIP too at this wedding. You know, it's not just a bride, you're equally VIPs.
yeah, definitely. And then I guess, when planning a wedding, couples sometimes have this they go on this search for so many vendors and then they have no idea what they're supposed to look for. And I know, as a planner, what do you think they should look for when they choose a wedding planner or a wedding coordinator? What are the things they should watch out for, I guess?
That's a great question. I feel like there's a few different things to focus on. I feel like number one is like find someone who whose personality jives with yours because this is going to be like a high touch vendor, like you're going to be communicating with this person a lot, and so you want to make sure that you can easily converse with them, that you feel like they communicate well and you can communicate with them. And also, like I was joking, like this is like a long-term relationship, guys, make sure you like me before you hire me. Like not as long as getting married, but you know, of all the vendors, you'll probably like be in contact with your planner the most. So that's like one thing that I think is really important to think about. And also, I think, you know, finding a planner whose style matches with yours. Like if you're a super type A bride and you hire a super low key wedding planner, like even if they're good at their job, just maybe their personality and their style of communication might make you anxious because you want over communication. Or vice versa. Like sometimes there's really type A wedding planners. I feel like that's the norm. Like that's a wedding planner trait right there. But if you're like low key and you like haven't been dreaming of your like perfect wedding since you were a child, you know, and you really just want to answer like the need to know questions and otherwise be fairly hands off, like you don't want someone asking you too many questions because then it's going to make you anxious. So trying to find that planner who's going to kind of match that energy level with you, I think is super important. Um, and then I feel like communication is like an obvious one. And I might be biased because I like plan destination weddings. And I take it very seriously that it's my job to bridge the gap between the vendors here in Hawaii and the clients that we have typically on the mainland. And, you know, everyone is really busy, but if I'm not the one answering questions or just letting them know that I saw that they reached out to me and had a question, then I feel like the anxiety builds the longer they wait to hear back from you. So I think just generally being prompt. I mean, you don't have to work 24/7, but actually my go-to like thing that's just really helped me because I always feel anxious about like getting back to people so quickly is I have an auto response on my email. And so, yeah, so if I'm out with an event, if like, and the client emails me, they're going to know right away, like, oh, hey, I have an event this day. And then my recovery days or these 2 days after, I'll get back to you on this day. And that gives everyone peace of mind. So just whatever you can do to communicate expectations and just things in general with clients is important. Um, I also think finding a planner who is accustomed to working with a budget similar to yours is a good thing to think about. Um, you know, you don't want to have like expectations that your wedding's gonna be like this, but your budget's like this. And it's really helpful to kind of see like examples from a wedding planner's portfolio of similar size weddings and budgets as yours before you even start planning, because then you could be like, oh yeah, like it does have just the right amount of like fancy rentals or flowers that I want, or or you might realize you could do a lot more. So I think that's super helpful when thinking about a wedding planner. And then finally, not all wedding planners are designers, but I do think, at least in terms of planners um, who care a lot about the aesthetic of a wedding, whether they're thoughtfully designing it or they just have an actual tendency to recommend vendors within a certain style, I think it's important to hire a planner who you appreciate their style, because then you're not having to like try and steer them in a direction that they're not accustomed to. So those are kind of my four top things to look for.
But I guess you mentioned that you work mostly for couples who work mostly with couples who plan destination weddings. Do you refer to like, do you end up like flying out a lot, or is it more of couples from out of state and flying into Hawaii?
That's a great question. Our home base is here, and so we primarily just plan weddings on the island of Oahu. So the wedding itself is just destination. I am not necessarily going to a destination, if that makes sense. Yeah, good question. People ask me that often.
That makes sense. But yeah, so given that, you plan a lot of destination weddings and you work with a lot of destination couples planning weddings in Hawaii, a lot of these couples well, most of them probably have not been to Hawaii or don't have that much of a familiarity with the area. And I can, I feel that sometimes our location is a bit more unique compared to others. So, for couples who are specifically planning a wedding on the island, um, what what do you feel is a piece of advice that you feel would be very valuable for them to keep in mind as they continue to like envision this wedding on the island?
Mm, that's a great question. I feel like I don't know, it's really hard to like narrow it down to like one piece of advice. I think the thing that comes to mind off the top of my head is just try and make a point of scheduling a visit at some point. Um, in the course of planning, it's not 100% like necessary, but I do think that if a couple can come and visit, not at the very, very beginning, I think it's good to kind of have a few things like in the works, like a few venues you want to check out, catering tastings to do, hair and makeup trials, um, cake tastings, these sort of things you cannot do from afar. And so, if, you know, before you make a decision about your venue or your caterer, it's nice if you can schedule a visit and try and do all of those things. And I feel like I have a lot of couples who get excited to do this, or there are a lot of couples who want to like come to Hawaii before they've even like done any research. And I think that's a lost opportunity. I think you definitely want to have some appointments in place. I think couples take for granted how busy wedding vendors are. And it's not like you can just call up the caterer and be like, can I do a tasting this afternoon? They're like, no, like you have to like wait a month and a half, like we're busy. So these are things that I will usually help my clients with before they make any big decisions. Um, but yeah, that's the one thing I think is really helpful for when you're planning a wedding in Hawaii. I have a lot of other things, but I don't know if you want me to expand.
Yeah, that does make sense, especially with a venue. I feel like sometimes what's on the website is different from, what's on Google Images is different from what you see up close, and then you get really overwhelmed when you get there and you lose the time because you don't have like this list of places that you really, really want to see.
Exactly, exactly. And like you can't just pop by a venue. You have to set up an appointment to get a tour. These are things that you have to factor in. And I mean, I'm such a nerd about it. Like when I have clients visit, like I list out all the places they want to go and all the things we want to do, and then I plot out our daily plans by like zones of the island, so they're not having to drive back and forth like the entire time, because that's a waste of time too, you know. So and also you never want to do two tastings on one day. You'll just be so full and be
Oh
miserable.
yeah.
You know, like even if the food's good, like it's just going to be painful.
Oh,
So like these are things that I think are really helpful to know. But kind of going back to what you were saying about the venue, you know, if you can't, it is different on a website than in person. Um, my hope is it's always better in person, at least the, you know, venues that I like to suggest. Um, but you aren't able to see things like what the restrooms look like, you know, like what the chairs they have available for you to use for your wedding actually look like in person. Like these things are not on the website. So you can get a lot more insight to your space, and actually think about like the guest flow and the terrain. All those things are factors you can figure
and
out
I
in
think
person.
that's really amazing that you end up going with them on like when they visit the venues, because sometimes there are things that they don't see like from a planning perspective, like okay, this place looks good but there's no power or something like
Right.
that,
Yeah.
or there are no restrooms.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And whenever I do site inspections with my clients, I like to kind of walk them through the space, and help them imagine how we would set it up, because I'm so familiar with that. Like, I don't even know I have to imagine. I know what it's going to look like because I've done it enough times. But I think if you've never had to plan an event or think about rentals and what they're going to look like in a space, it's really hard and overwhelming to imagine like what to do with the space. So that can be helpful to do in person.
That makes sense, yeah. And do you still work with local couples, or is it more of the bulk like destination?
Yeah, you know, I have two local clients in October out of five. I would say that's a little bit more than normal. I probably have, you know, like five or six local couples a year that I work with. And actually, I always say, like, even though a lot of my weddings are destination weddings, many of them are what I call semi-destination weddings, where either like the bride or the groom or their
Yep.
families like
In
still live
Hawaii.
in Hawaii, but they don't necessarily live here. And so, I mean, they're familiar with the island and a lot of things, but they want to give their guests who are flying in like the Hawaii experience.
Um, that's true. We feel like we have a lot of couples who are like um people or brides or grooms who grew up on the island and then ended up moving to work and finally feel like, it feels like a coming home of sorts for them to have their wedding on
Yeah,
Oahu.
yeah. It's fun because I mean, if you think about it, you know, I mean, I did grow up in Hawaii, but I love the idea of like bringing people from my adult life to my hometown and give them that experience, you know. And so that's kind of what we do when we're planning these semi-destination weddings. We're like introducing them to the food and the beautiful views and like all these different things that will be completely new to these people.
Especially when it's the first time for these people to like come. I feel like it's always a good experience for them because usually they just seen it in movies or documentaries, and yeah, it's good to like see these people like fall in love with the island.
Yeah, and I feel like, you know, when you're a visitor to an island, you know, some people are really good about doing research and like getting off the beaten track, but a lot of people are just kind of like show up and they're like, oh, okay, well, what am I going to do? And you wouldn't naturally wander into places like, you know, Jumanji at Kulo Ranch or like Lani Kuano, like these really beautiful outdoor spaces that you really only get to experience when you're at a wedding. So I think that, you know, brings like a whole new level to a destination kind of vacation and wedding.
That makes sense. And then I guess I have another question with regards to wedding planning. I feel like there's usually a lot of confusion about the kind of like the coverage that a planner provides. Like they don't really understand what like like a full planning service is and how it's different from like a semi like
Or
full.
like a day of or partial.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like it's like a partial, like because there's like full, partial, and then the day of. Can you like elaborate more about that?
Oh, yes. So, I mean, I think the important thing to know is every planner runs their business a little bit differently. So you're not always going to be, you know, you're not going to be able to compare apples to apples in all situations. And this goes for any small business. You know, everyone's got their own processes. But I think there's like kind of like three main categories with some like add-ons, maybe is the way to put it. I think that's just when I'm like thinking of how we do things. So like on a smaller scale, you're looking at like a day of coordinator. When you say a day of coordinator, it doesn't just mean someone who's going to show up on the wedding day that you've never met. Usually there's some sort of like meeting a month before, a few weeks before, where they gather the information that they need in order to prepare for your event. And then it's their job to just make sure that the vendors arrive on time and that the timeline runs as smoothly as possible. So that's a day of coordinator. Partial planning, this is actually our minimum. We don't offer a day of coordination just because communication and just like the relationships with our clients are so important to us that we like to be fairly involved from the beginning. But we do offer something called we call it maid of honor for hire. I always joke, I'm like, I want you to imagine you had a really good friend. You could just call up and be like, hey, Louise, like I have a question. So it's essentially strategic guidance and unlimited consulting from the time that they book us up until 1 month before the wedding, where we step in kind of like month of coordinator would. But what we offer is basically like guidance on kind of the order we suggest they plan their wedding. And then we help them put together a custom budget. We give them vendor suggestions, and they can reach out to us anytime. So we have unlimited consulting. They can have Zoom calls with us, email us, and we just kind of put it in their hands to reach out to us when they need help. But then ultimately they're responsible for reaching out to vendors and booking and everything like that. So that's kind of like a partial planning service. And then full service is where a planner is going to help a couple from beginning to end. And their job is going to be to correspond with the vendors directly. So they're still going to do things like come up with a budget plan to get a sense of like what their priorities are and what their overall vision is. And then they'll kind of help them through the planning process step by step. So the couple doesn't have to feel the whole weight of the project on their shoulders. Rather, they only have to focus on what the wedding planner is telling them to focus on at any given time. And then it's the planner's responsibility to make sure that the planning stays on track. So all of these should include the actual coordination of the wedding day itself as well, because that's the most important part. But something else to keep in mind, aside from those three main categories, is some planners also design weddings and some don't. And so that's something to think about. Like if you are really eager to have someone help you design your wedding, you want to find someone who specializes in that. And so when we work with our full service couples, we have a whole like third of the planning dedicated to helping them design their wedding. And that starts off with like lots of visual aids. So like mood boards and then design presentations. And then just really helping them visualize everything before we start locking down rentals and flowers. Because I mean, you can still book rentals and flowers and graphic design and all of those things without understanding exactly what they're going to look like together. But our job is to help make it cohesive, be on budget, be unique, like taking into consideration all these factors before they put money down on them. So yeah, I think those are kind of like maybe 4 categories to consider with planners.
That's so useful because I'm like thinking sometimes you end up booking a floral designer, you end up booking your decor, you book your graphic designer, but if you don't, some people just don't have that eye, to like see if it goes together because
Yeah,
sometimes things individually look really good and then
right.
put together it kind of feels a bit off and
Yeah,
I feel like having someone to like help guide you through that is very helpful
yeah,
because nothing is disjointed like when you actually see it. And I guess just like what you said, the effort to plan and even the investment involved is well worth it because it was like really well thought of.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And we actually started offering like our design phase as an add-on service for our partial planning clients because not all couples need full service, but they often really care about the design. So we kind of have like an in-between service where they can hire us for the partial planning consulting. And then when they start thinking about the design part, then they can hire us on to help them create this concept for their wedding. So that's kind of a nice in between option. Try and not have too much a la carte because then it gets confusing. But that one is just fun, so we can't help ourselves.
Awesome. And I guess one thing with the planning as well, because I feel like the timeline, like the wedding day timeline, is a vital part of the day. Is this something that usually the couple can rely on the their planner to do regardless of the whether it's on the day or
That's a
partial
great
or
question. Um, the planner should be involved in some way with the timeline creation. Um, I tend to be very hands on it. That's just my like planning style. um, and for me, like just like the design, I like to really customize each event. So I ask a lot of questions to kind of get a sense of what the couple wants to do and then think about how it's going to flow and everything. I feel like partial and full definitely will be pretty hands on with that. Um, month of, I'm not quite sure. I mean, I imagine they're going to help you create an outline, but it more might be more template based, where they kind of have like a formula that they like to use all the time, and because they're not involved in everything from beginning to end in terms of planning, it might just be simpler to kind of like standardize it a little bit. But again, because we don't do day of coordination, I don't know that I can speak for all day of coordinators. Yeah.
yeah, that definitely makes sense. Because I think I was just wondering because I guess for us as photographers, it's something that we rely on really heavily during the day because it tells us where we're supposed to be, what we're supposed to do, and it's definitely something that we see as a valuable part of the planning process.
Yeah. Creating timelines is super time consuming as a coordinator. So I don't know if you've ever checked out our blog, or maybe you could link to it in the notes, but we have a blog post about how to create your wedding day timeline. And just like the design, I like to think about it in layers. So think about like, okay, what things do you want to do on your wedding day? Is it ceremony, cocktail, or reception? Are you doing the cake cutting, first dance, toast, those sort of things, like basics, right? And then from there, you got to build on it. Think about the logistics, like how are people getting to and from? What is the getting ready schedule? And then you got to build on it on top of that. And you got to think about each individual vendor. What things do they need to know? When do they need to show up? Do they have the address? Do they have the room number? Like do they know when the champagne needs to be poured, or like all these little details for every single vendor. And then on top of that, then I add my team details in because we have our own things that we're doing. So there's so many layers to timelines, and you always want to find this balance of making sure there's enough information for all the vendors so they feel supported and in the loop, but also not so long that they glaze over when they look at it and they're like, oh my gosh, this is the boringest long document I've ever looked at. So yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah, I think yeah, I feel like it's a lot of work, and it also I feel involves a lot of estimating because I kind of wonder how do you know how long like it will take to travel from point A to point B,
Mhm.
and
Yeah,
predict like the traffic conditions at a certain time.
for sure, for sure. Well, I mean, if you have a good network of vendors that you work with, you can ask them. For the transportation companies, I've done many of these routes enough times that I already know these answers. But when I first started working with them, I asked them like, how long do you anticipate this transfer to be, like conservatively, and then we plan according to that. And even when we organize guest transportation, I always account for them arriving 30 minutes before the ceremony because you don't know about traffic. But if they do actually arrive 30 minutes before, then we'll have some welcome drinks and a guest book for them, assign like something to do so they're not like just standing there. But it's really important to account for buffer in the timeline. Otherwise, you get way behind schedule and that's no good.
Yeah, the, yeah, I can definitely imagine. And then when thinking about wedding planning, um, sometimes especially when you're planning a destination wedding, there's a lot of stress because everything is like an ocean away or a plane ride away. And so, um, how do you have like any methods to help brides feel a bit less stressed during the planning process?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I pride myself in making like the planning process as stress free as possible. I always have clients who are like, my friends keep on asking me if I'm stressed, and I keep on being like, no, should I be? And I'm like, yes, that's what I want to hear. But yeah, I can, attribute it to a few different things. I feel like one is just generally setting clients up for success from the beginning. So there's a few things that I do in order to accomplish that. One is we use wedding planning software to keep track of everything related to a client's project. So it's essentially like a digital wedding binder, and within it, there's our customized checklist for that couple with all the things that they're going to want to think about. It might be more than they even want to do for the wedding, but at least they know that they're not forgetting anything. There's a place for us to put all the details of the wedding day timeline in there, the guest list, and not just the guest list, but all the details, meal choices, food allergies, who needs a high chair, all of these things. There's a 2-scale layout schematic within it where we can create like the layout, and then it syncs with the guest list so we can do the seating chart later. There's also a place to save all of the vendor contracts and contact information. I think this is super helpful because if you've ever planned any event, you're having a million emails and it's hard to keep track of what documents are most up to date. And then just the budget. And I think having a conversation about the budget in the very beginning is like kind of the second thing. And my goal whenever I work with couples is to understand what their priorities are and what their goal budget is. And obviously there's some budget education involved with each couple. They don't always know how much things cost. And so I really do make a point of breaking it down by vendor section and all the things that I think they're going to need to accomplish their event, and really prioritizing their funds in areas that they care about most. And, maybe like recommending they skip things that they care about less, kind of helping guide them on the best way to allocate their funds. And so by setting them up with this aisle planner account and talking about the budget from the get-go, I think that really helps them outline the scope of the project and give them like goals for each vendor category that they're booking. So instead of just hoping that their budget's going to work out, they know like, hey, if I spend this much on this, I'll be on budget. So that's like one of our ways to really kind of help put our clients at ease. The other thing that I do, I don't know that other planners do this, but I like to break up the planning into phases. I like to think about like an order of operations. I've planned enough weddings at this point that I know it just makes sense to do some things before you do other things, because then you got to go back and redo those things if you did it in the wrong order. So I usually will kind of break the planning up into 3 different planning phases, and that way they're not having to worry about the whole project the entire time. They can just focus on one section of vendors and kind of knock those out, and then I'll give them like kind of the goal due date for that phase, and then they can move on to the next category. Because I think the tendency is to get really excited about the decor, which can you blame them? That's the fun part. But I think it's better to focus on what I call foundations vendors first, like obviously figuring out your venue, thinking about food, because that's going to be one of your biggest costs. And then booking your photographer, videographer, music and entertainment, stylist, and officiant. And once you kind of get those squared away, then you can start transitioning into the design. And at that point, you've maybe spent a few months perusing Pinterest or Instagram, or kind of like honing in on what you really like. So just by breaking down into phases, I think that helps. And for me, I'm like constantly communicating with my clients, reiterating these steps. So I tell them that I explain my phases in the consultation. When I set them up with the initial aisle planner count and the budget, I reiterate, we're going to focus on foundations vendors first. Here they are listed in a checklist. We're going to spend this amount of time on it, and then I will reach out to you when it's time to work on this. And then as we reach each phase, I send them like a summary email kind of breaking down what that phase looks like and linking to all sorts of resources. I have a blog post or a blog where I've written all sorts of blog posts to support these tasks. This is how I spent COVID shutdown, is writing blog posts. I'm like, what are all the things you'll ask me all the time? And then that way they're just like constantly being assured that they are where they need to be in the scope of planning, and they're not worrying if they're missing anything. I think the biggest stressor is not knowing what you don't know when you're planning a wedding. Does that make sense? Yeah. And then I think the final thing that we do that really helps put our clients at ease is our like in the design part and our floral design as well. We create these style boards, and just having visuals for this part of the wedding is super helpful in gaining our clients' trust and confidence. Because if they can see a picture and be like, yes, that is what I want, we are on the same page, then they don't have to just wonder if it's going to look like they want it to when they show up on the wedding day. If that makes sense. So, yeah, those are kind of our key ways of just helping our clients feel less stress.
That sounds amazing. That actually sounds really awesome. And uh, could you, I guess my one last question is, are there, can you share maybe some challenges that you see couples face when planning their wedding and what you think are some ways that they can avoid or prevent like stumbling through into these challenges?
Yeah. One that just breaks my heart every single time I encounter this is when couples book a bunch of stuff before they book their planner, because they end up making decisions that affect a lot of factors, in particular the budget, in ways that they don't realize until it's too late. So I think whether you're hiring a planner or you're just hiring like an hour of a planner's time to consult with them before making big decisions, I think that's really, really wise and will save a lot of stress. Um, that's like the one thing that comes to mind. I think also just getting on the same page about money at the beginning of planning a wedding is super important. And that's why I really stress having both spouses and the couple join that budget meeting, because I find that they just need some budget education. And even if parents are participating in the budget in any way or paying for the wedding, have them join the meeting too. Because I can't tell you how many times I've done a budget breakdown. And at the end, I always ask, how do you feel about this? Are there certain things that you feel that are like more than you expected or less than you expected? And because I really take the time to explain what you're paying for in each vendor category, they're usually like, oh, well, yeah, that makes sense. I understand why it adds up that way. But if you just don't have that education, you can feel like you're paying more than you need to if you just don't understand where it's going.
Yeah. And then if you don't track it, you kind of just wonder, why are we bleeding money?
I feel like I'm too much of a planner that I can't even imagine not tracking your budget. But I mean, that would be nice, not have to worry about it.
Thank you so much, Louise. And then I do have four last questions that we usually ask our guests, and we call this HNL floor. And probably the first one is, what's your favorite resource that you recommend for couples planning their wedding in Hawaii?
Ooh. I mean, I might be biased, but I really like my blog. Basically, everything that's in my brain, I like wrote it down. Um, Outside of that, if you're not like planning a wedding in Hawaii in particular, there's another blog that I really love called A Practical Wedding. And I think it just has such a beautiful perspective on, you know, keeping things in perspective when you're planning, because, you know, you can get carried away with all the things, but it's really important to focus on the why when you're planning a wedding, and just being very mindful of that is helpful. Yeah.
That sounds great. And then the next one is, can you share what some of your hobbies are and what things you like to do for fun, outside of the design and the wedding planning space?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I feel like I have a tendency to make my hobbies into my career, which is maybe a problem and why I started the whole floral design part of my business. But I do love flowers and I do love arranging flowers. But when I'm trying not to work, I like to go hiking. I like to do yoga, hang out with my cats. I love to cook.
How many cats do you have?
I have two. I have two fur babies.
I have one, and I'm thinking of getting another one.
I mean, why not?
I think it's more fun when you have two. It makes things more lively.
Yeah, well, when we got our second cat, our first cat was already like 14 years old and he was used to being an only child. He was very mad about it for like a week. And I think he still resents it a little bit, but they do snuggle every once in a while, so I don't feel as bad.
Oh wow. How did you get Yeah, wow. Okay, that's something to keep in mind. Mine is like 2 years old, so
Oh,
they're
yeah,
still
that should be fine.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry I interrupted you, but
No,
you
no, no. I was just gonna say when a cat is really old and creaky and has arthritis, it's a little different introducing the kitten into the into the home than it is when a cat's two. So yeah, it should be fine.
And then the third question is what do you believe is the reason that you do what you do with, design, wedding planning and design?
Yeah. Um, oh, I mean, there are a few different reasons. One is just I've always had a creative spirit, and I don't know, I can't hone in on like one thing that I want to do. So being able to have my hands in flowers and thinking about like tasty menus and decorating things and all of that is just like a great way for me to kind of express all my different types of creativity. But I also feel like I really enjoy making people happy, for better, for worse, and for me, like it just fills my cup to just make a couple so incredibly happy on their wedding day and like make things beyond their expectations. That's what really drives me and gets me excited to get up and go to work every day.
Yeah, definitely. Especially knowing that this is something that they're gonna look back to
Yeah,
like
yeah,
decades from now.
right, yeah.
And then, if people want to get in touch of you, can get in touch with you, where can they find you and where can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, for sure. So we have a great website. It's loveletterweddings.com. And on there, we have our galleries and our blog posts, our contact form, um, about our services, like all the things. I really try and put all the information on there. Um, we're also on Instagram. We have two Instagram accounts. We have one for planning and one for florals. It's Love Letter Weddings with an underscore between each word for the planning one, and then Love Letter Weddings plural, all one word for our flowers. Um, we're a little bit on TikTok, but just dabbling right now. But yeah, I think those are kind of the main places to find us.
Okay. On TikTok, is it at Love Letter Weddings? Like,
Mhm.
okay. And then, yeah, before we close out, is there anything you want to add? Anything you want to share or that you feel our couples might find useful?
Yeah, I mean, I just encourage couples to like make it a joyful experience planning a wedding. I feel like there's so much pressure on family expectations, traditions, Pinterest. Like all of these things can really make it quite stressful to plan a wedding. But I think if you really set your intention on how you want to feel as on the wedding day, as well as you're planning your wedding, I think that'll really help you. Just keep things in perspective and enjoy the process.
Thank you so much, Louise. It was such a pleasure having you with us today, and I'm sure our couples will find all of the information and everything that we talked about useful and helpful for them as they go on their journey.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much, guys, for tuning in with us and watching. And if you're looking for wedding photography, videography, and photo booth, or if you're looking for wedding resources, you can visit us at www.hnlstudios.com. And we do invite you to like, subscribe, and leave a comment just to make sure that you don't miss any future episodes. And we'll see you guys next time. Thank you, guys. Bye.